It's closing down her airway, and she's being deprived of oxygen. Any doctor who's got a brain in their head knows to relieve that hematoma. How do you relieve it? Open the wound, let it bleed, get it out of there. My client went into the hospital for a routine surgery, a simple elective thyroid procedure. But by the end of the day, she would never walk or talk again. A nightmare unfolded. This is the story about my first ever traumatic brain injury case, which changed my career forever. My client was a 52-year-old woman from Puerto Rico. She migrated to the United States as a child with her mother and sister, and she moved to the Capital District here in New York, and she developed a life for herself there. She worked, she had friends, relationships. She was a spitfire. She was a fighter. She was in good health, except for she had a thyroid problem that caused her to lose a lot of weight, and she was having sweats. So she got worked up, and they said, you have an overactive thyroid, it could come out. So she saw a general surgeon who was well experienced, and candidly, he was qualified to do the surgery. He evaluated her once and said, we can do it. We can take the thyroid out, and that'll probably solve your problem. And so she agreed to this surgery that did not need to happen. So when surgeries don't need to happen, they're called elective procedures. The patient elects to have it. It's not absolutely necessary. She could have combated the problem with medication. But with elective procedures, they're usually pretty mundane. They usually go off without a hitch and there's no problem. She got the usual pre-surgical workup, and it was determined that she was healthy. She was healthy enough to have this surgery. The thought was that she was going to have an outpatient procedure and be on her way, probably be back to work in less than a week. And to be totally candid, the surgery had no complications. There were no issues with respect to the surgery itself. The nightmare begins to unfold after the surgery, and this case centers on post-operative complications. So after a surgery, what happens is they go to this area of the hospital. It's right outside of the operating department. It's called the post-anesthesia care unit. That's where people go to recover from anesthesia. Some people have adverse effects of anesthesia, but more so you sort of come out and you feel loopy, and before they let you walk around or eat again, you have to be sort of clear of this anesthetic. So she goes to the anesthesia unit to recover, and she comes out of anesthesia as one might expect, and she's doing fine. But the problem starts to arise when the nursing staff realizes that the hospital is overstaffed. And so there's nowhere to send her out of the PACU. They have nowhere to send her on the admitting floors. And so the staff in the PACU, they are waiting for a room and a bed, and it's not available. It's not coming. And so my client has a 5-hour stay in the PACU. You're supposed to be there for 30 minutes to an hour and move on. You either get discharged from the hospital or you go to the admitting floor. The PACU is not a comfortable or soothing environment. The beds suck. You're on a stretcher. You're not actually in a hospital bed. So my client, as the records show, she wasn't comfortable. And she was getting frustrated because you can't have visitors in the PACU. She wanted to see her family. She started to feel anxious and frustrated that she wasn't advancing on. And that's very clear in the record. Now, her physical condition was otherwise fine. There are surgical drains in the area where the surgery was performed to discharge fluids and blood. There were inspections of the wound. Everything was fine in the PACU. She finally, after 5 hours, gets a bed on the floor, and this is when things go crazy. So So what we learned is that what happened to her, it wasn't a complication, it wasn't bad luck. What's about to unfold is a series of preventable medical errors. And this woman suffers a catastrophic outcome because of the failure of doctors, nurses, and other medical professionals. And one thing you need to know before we go on in this story is a little bit about thyroid procedures. So she underwent a full thyroidectomy. So the idea was that the surgeon was going to remove her entire thyroid from right here on the front part of her neck. And this area of the neck is vascular, meaning there's a lot of meat, there's a lot of blood, there are veins in this area. And so when you do surgery, it bleeds. So anytime that we're doing spine surgery or removing thyroids or just probing this area, we have to be ready for bleeding. Why? Because when you bleed in this tight space, where your throat is, where you breathe, things can get bad really quickly. And we have to be able to intervene. We have to respond expeditiously. So finally, going back to the PACU, my client gets discharged. Rather than a nurse or a doctor accompany her from the basement level where the operating department was and where the PACU was, they call a technician with very little medical training to transport my client from the basement all the way up to the 5th floor of the hospital. This technician comes in, she pulls her out into the hallway, they get on the elevator, and once the elevator doors close, my client sits up. And I'll never forget, during the deposition of the technician, she said she didn't know what to do. And she said, my client started to writhe. She was writhing on the bed. And she was grabbing for her throat. This poor technician, who has no idea what to do, is panicked while the elevator doors are closed and the elevator is climbing up the hospital. They finally get to the floor, the doors open, my client is just jumping all over the bed, reaching for her throat. The technician now has to get this bed off of the elevator, down a long corridor to double doors. She has to hit a button to get in, only then to finally get to the nursing station where they might get some help. So they get to the nurse's station, the technician calls out, my client is still flailing on the bed. Nurses come, they immediately identify, based on the fact that she's grabbing for her throat, that they need a higher level of care. So they start some type of emergency response. Now, the nurses are trying to stabilize her, but she just can't be stabilized. And a respiratory therapist and a hospitalist respond to this distress call. Now, a respiratory therapist is someone who staffs a hospital and they go around helping people who have pulmonary issues. A hospitalist is essentially a doctor of internal medicine who, again, staffs the hospital, and they sort of become the primary care physician for patients while they're in the hospital, and they manage their care and they help deal with specialists. But they're internists. They're not surgeons, and their level of knowledge only goes so far. They know the situation is bad. The respiratory therapist starts to evaluate the airway, which is the right instinct, and the hospitalist makes this awful decision that cost my client her life. The hospitalist decides, rather than stabilize the patient on the floor, who clearly has an airway obstruction, he decides to send her down 2 levels to the intensive care unit. This was a dumb decision. This was medical negligence in its purest form. Now, another interesting note is that the nurse manager, one of the few nurses who responded to my client's bedside, she testified in the 20th deposition of this case that she saw blood oozing from the surgical site. And what that blood means is that there was a hematoma growing at the surgical site. And that hematoma was expanding in her neck, and it's got nowhere to go. So what's it doing? It's closing down her airway, and she's being deprived of oxygen. Any doctor who's got a brain in their head knows to relieve that hematoma. How do you relieve it? Open the wound, let it bleed, get it out of there. But instead, this doctor sends the woman back down the hallway, on the elevator, 2 floors down, then down another corridor to the intensive care unit. That's exactly what happens. So now my client, she is decompensating the entire way. No one's intervening, they're just moving her, losing critical time. By the time she gets to the intensive care unit, we're basically losing her. She is without oxygen, she's not breathing well. They finally call Code Blue. Code Blue is DEFCON 5. It's get everybody here now, right now. And so now an anesthesiologist runs up from the basement operating department, runs up the stairs. The respiratory therapist did follow. They're trying to use a airbag basically to get forced oxygen, but it's not getting past that obstruction. And the poor respiratory therapist isn't really trained, but knows we've got to relieve that hematoma. Meanwhile, the anesthesiologist finally shows up. Now, you have to understand, anesthesiologists are essentially airway experts because when you're in surgery, most of the time you have a tube down your throat enabling you to breathe. And so they try to pass a tube. They want to get her a clear airway, but they can't. Why can't they pass the tube? Because there's an obstruction in the neck. And the anesthesiologist finally understands we've got to let that go, and he does just enough to loosen the stitches. The blood starts to flow. They change out this tube for a smaller one, and they get her an airway. Thank goodness. But it's too late. Her brain went without oxygen for several minutes. And honestly, it's still hard for me to tell the story because I think about the consequence for this woman. Her life was, she was still alive, but her life was over. She didn't leave the hospital for about 5 months. From the hospital, she went to therapy unit after therapy unit. So what is the consequence of an anoxic brain injury for an otherwise healthy 52-year-old woman? It was everything that you and I know in life. It was her independence. She never walked again. She never talked again. To the extent that for some brief period she tried to eat solid foods, that didn't last long. She had to eat purees and be tube fed. She developed myoclonic tremor. So basically her brain had short circuited, and now it is sending bad messages to the nerve endings in her entire body. So for the rest of her life, she just jerked in bed. And in order to make that awful jerking movement go away, they basically had to drug her so that she was sedated. She really never left her bed again. So this woman went to the hospital for an elective procedure and sacrificed all of her health. Her life expectancy fell off a cliff. She needed nutritionists, therapists around the clock. From the day that she was discharged back home, which was many, many months later, she had to have 24-hour care. Imagine living the rest of your life with someone seated next to your bed, a stranger. There is no worse outcome. And so we then prosecuted a case against the hospital, against the anesthesiologist, the surgeon, and the hospitalist who caused this woman such a devastating outcome. And I didn't know this family when they called me. In fact, at this point in my career, I was a young lawyer. I was waiting for my big opportunity. And when this call came in, when I heard that this woman was healthy and went in for a routine procedure but left with an anoxic brain injury, I knew something went wrong. Like, that is not the right outcome. Something devastating, something very wrong happened. And so I went right to work. And I utilized this procedure called pre-action discovery. I went to the hospital before I even started a lawsuit, and I said, let me in. I want to see it. I want to see the entire file. And I'll never forget feeling to some extent that I was not qualified to handle this case, sitting in a basement, going through these records. I didn't know the first thing about thyroid procedures. I didn't even know what a PACU was. I just knew that this should not have happened. And I brought a portable scanner. I scanned hundreds and hundreds of pages. I went home. And I remember taking a picture of it. I probably still have it somewhere. A stack of records this big. I hired all of the best experts. I traveled the state to meet with these experts, and we took the case to the hospital. And we did 20 depositions. The 20th deposition was the witness who blew the case wide open, that nurse manager who said she saw blood at the surgical site. I remember one of the most senior and experienced lawyers saying to me, John, why do we do all these depositions? And he was trying to get me to reconsider. It was the last deposition that blew the case open. The hospital was trying to prevent me from getting to that witness. They were trying to hide this key piece of evidence where on the 5th floor, there was blood at the surgical site. That should have been the indication to stop, stabilize, protect the airway. The case took years, obviously, as most complicated medical malpractice cases do. We did a lot of discovery. We had a team of 5 experts. It was a lot of fun, the case, for me as a young lawyer, despite the fact that this woman paid such a heavy cost. I loved this case. I gave it my all. My family gave it their all, because on weekends I was at this woman's house, meeting with her, meeting with the family. I was trying to understand, what is a day in the life like for this woman? What services do we need to get? She went back to her apartment, which was this small 2nd floor apartment. Well, how do you get a woman who can't walk and she needs a wheelchair? How do you get in and out of a 2nd floor apartment? So we needed to know, what are we trying to achieve through this case? Other than bring transparency to what happened, we need money, damages, to make this woman have a more comfortable life. We knew we needed to get her an apartment or an assisted living facility or a home with not many steps. Probably a 1-level place. We needed doors wide enough for wheelchairs. We needed a hospital bed. We needed a vehicle for wheelchairs to go in and out, because she couldn't get anywhere. If she couldn't make arrangements with a medical transport company, she couldn't go. She couldn't get out of her house. And medical transport companies only go to doctors. Well, what about if she wanted to go to a family party? What if she wanted to go sit in a park? She couldn't do any of those things. So we needed to have an understanding as to what things, equipment, personnel, staffing she would need to live a comfortable life in the condition that she was in. And so in order to prove that, we got a life care planner who understands medicine and medical equipment and future treatment needs, and we got a bill. We basically got a bill for the rest of this woman's life, annuitized annually, and we gave that to the hospital and said, this is how much money you need to come up with to start negotiations, to start. And then we're going to talk about her pain and suffering, the loss of enjoyment of quality of life. That number is hard to calculate, because no amount of money is going to make her whole. But the law provides for only one means of recourse, and we have to put a dollar value against the cost that this human being paid with her life and health. And we did that. And this case settled for multiple millions of dollars after 3 years of litigation. By the way, it settled on the eve of trial. The hospital and the doctors were still frantically trying to put together a fair offer when they finally offered an amount of money that approached fairness and justice. Now, we did let the surgeon out of the case. We discontinued against the surgeon because the surgeon didn't do anything wrong. He did his job, but we used the surgeon as our expert, and we got an understanding of how thyroid procedures are done. We let out the anesthesiologist because he ultimately saved this woman's life, and he was just dealing with an already bad situation. The hospital and the hospitalist, that physician that made such a monumental failure and decision, he paid the freight of the settlement, the lion's share of the settlement. Some of the settlement was annuitized so that the client did not have the responsibility of managing the money. We made sure that financial advisors could take the money, reinvest it. We could see our settlement amount grow and get deployed slowly month after month to pay the personnel that were necessary to care for my client, to pay the mortgage, to pay monthly bills and things of that nature. So that is the case that one showed to me that I could handle serious, complex litigation. It was my first ever serious traumatic brain injury case. And it was from that case and that close relationship that I developed with the clients that caused me to fall in love with traumatic brain injury litigation. And by the way, I will share with you here that my father was the victim of a traumatic brain injury. And so I empathize with the victim of TBI as well as their family and caretakers because I've been there. I've walked those shoes. I know how devastating a TBI can be on both the victim and the family. Physically, emotionally, financially, I have seen it firsthand. And so I've been able to use my own personal story with my father and this very serious traumatic brain injury case to guide how I approach TBI cases, how I market myself, because I like helping people in those situations. I have become very astutely aware of the human brain, how it works, the medicine required to understand it. I also know that we can rehab the brain to some extent, depending on the severity of the injury and the loss. And it's just become my passion to represent people who have suffered traumatic brain injury. And anytime I can help somebody recover, whether it be physically, financially, or otherwise, it is an absolute joy for me to handle those types of cases. Remember, I'm John DeGasperis, the founder at New York Injury Law. I just shared with you a real injury story from my practice. I deal with these types of cases every day. If you want me to hear your story and represent you or a family member, call my office today for a free consultation.